Hello and welcome back. My name is Dennis Mabuka, and in this video we'll be creating this really gross looking animation, and we'll be specifically focusing on how to make these boiling boils so you can creep out your squeamish friends. So I came across this workflow while working on my first NFT collection, which you can find in the link in the description. And the collection is really about the dark places that sometimes our minds can find themselves. So you can check them out in the link in the description and see the backstory and the inspiration behind each piece. And yeah, here they are. So I find it really unfortunate about how this whole topic has become very divisive, but I really encourage you to look into the crypto space and all the kinds of new opportunities that this space is creating in this new digital economy on the internet. Because I feel like there's plenty of opportunities just around the corner for really anyone who's been into creating basically just anything in the digital space. So yeah, I'd encourage you to check it out, and without further ado, let's just jump into Blender and start cooking. So I have Faceless over here inside Blender, and I've just added all these detail inside sculpt mode just by sculpting all these blobs around the left eye socket. And I'm working using the multi-res modifier so I can add detail on different layers. And then I'm adding these blobs. I'm using the blob brush, and what I've done is just change the fall off to sphere so that as I sculpt, I can have nice and spherical blobs, and I'll just change around the radius and add the detail where I want it all around the model until I have something that I like. And also, as I add in all this detail, I like to apply the base every once in a while so that all the details that I've added on the layers on top will be baked into the underlying mesh. So with that done, the next thing we want to do is create the setup for animating all these blobs, and we'll be animating it using the displace modifier. But since we don't want the displace modifier to affect the whole surface of the whole mesh, we want to give it a way to target just these blobs, and we'll do that using the weight paint mode and set some weights to the specific vertexes around these blobs. So I'll use a weight of about 0.6, and again with the fall off of the brush set to sphere just so I can easily select spherical areas with a harsh fall off. I'll just, by playing around with the radius, just click around the blobs that I want to be influenced by the displace modifier. And then I'll just go around selecting all. You don't have to really get all of them, but I'll just select. You want to get the really prominent ones that you know will be visible in your animation. And then because I wanted the focus of it to be around this left eye socket, I'll again select a bunch of ones around these eye sockets. And yeah. So with that done, I'll just name this vertex group to something like boils, and then Just save that out, and then we'll use this vertex group inside our displacement modifier to just tell the modifier to affect these specific localized regions on the mesh. And one more thing we're going to do is go to the vertex paint mode. And when you do that, you'll notice that a new slot is set up in the vertex colors. And what we want to do is extract a map that we'll use in two ways when we go to set up our materials. One, we'll use it to isolate all these blobs and give them different properties inside our materials to just get them to look really, really gross. And then two, I'm going to use the same map to extract just a lot more details in the texture that I'm using on the actual mesh itself. And you'll see what I mean when we go to set up our materials. So I'll just go to paint and then dirty vertex colors. And then after a few seconds, you'll see that it generates a black and white map really, where the blobs are sort of white and the crevices are black. And then inside the shader, we can play around and tweak out this map using the color ramp node to get it to look in all sorts of ways. So the first thing I'll do is I'll add an empty, and this empty will be what we use to animate the texture that we use in our displacement map. And then I'll select the skull, and then I'll just reduce the levels of the multi-res modifier in the viewport just for better performance. And then I'll add a displace modifier, and then add the earlier boils vertex group that we created, so that now you can see it's only these regions that are affected by the texture. And then I'll add a new texture, and then first set the coordinates of the texture to object, and then select that empty that we created earlier. And then I can now go into the texture and then set up the kind of texture that I want. I'll set it as clouds. And then now you can set up the scale of the texture. If you move this around, you'll see how it's influencing the boils on the surface. But really what I want is I'm using the largest boil as my guide to see how big I want the texture to look. When the animation is running, I don't really want to see detail in this large boil. So I'm using that as my reference. And you can see what I'm talking about if you look at the difference between these two animations here. So I'm just using the large boil as my guide to set up the size of the texture so that I don't see detail in the movement of these big boils. And that gives me just a look that I really like. Then from there, you can play around with the strength in your displace modifier to get just all sorts of different kinds of looks. So now if you grab your object and animate its rotation and movement, you'll see how it's influencing also the movement on the displacement on the mesh, which is just really, really cool. And this is a technique that I like to use a lot. So now for the shading, and this is where we can really crank up that gross factor to 1000. I have here a really simple material. It's just a bunch of image textures feeding into each other to give this simple material, and a noise texture plugged into the displacement to just give it some roughness. So as I mentioned, we're going to use the vertex colors we created earlier for two purposes. One, I want to target these blobs and give them some subsurface scattering only localized to those areas to give it this feeling like the blobs are filled with pus. So I'll add in the input, add a vertex color node, and I like to use it along with the color ramp node just so I can tweak it dynamically on the fly. And then I'll select the colors that we created earlier, and this is what they look like. And I also like to use the color ramp node in B-spline mode. It just gives me more gradual change in the colors, and I prefer it that way. So with that, I'll tweak that mask and then just plug this into the subsurface of this displacement node, and we'll see what that looks like in a second. Yeah, so that's working. And then you can start now tweaking this on the fly using the color ramp node and really dial in so that you can have that effect really affect the areas that you want to target. And just like that, I think that looks cool. And something else that you could do, you see I have the color of the subsurf set to a yellowish color. To give it some more variation, you could add a mix color node and then set this to say, no, in fact, what I'll do, I'll just add a noise texture. Where'd it go? Noise texture. Tweak the scale. Again, also feed this into a color ramp node. And then now I can set the colors of the texture inside this color ramp node. So I want it to be some variation between a reddish color and a yellowish, disgusting color. So something like that. Awesome. And then I'll plug this into the color of the subsurf so that now we also have variation in the colors of the blobs, of the pus inside these blobs. Just like that. That's really, really cool. And then the next thing I want to do using this vertex colors we created, I want to use it to introduce some more variation in the base textures that is feeding into the principal shader. So I'll just add a mix color node right there, and then maybe use a different one. Select the color ramp, Control-Shift-D so that you can duplicate it while it's still connected. And then plug this into the bottom input. And then use the color burn node. And you'll see what that does. And then I'll just use this to tweak it and dial it in so that I'm just using this map to extract more detail and more contrast in the base textures that I'm using here. So this is what the texture looks like before. And then I'm just using that black and white map to exaggerate the contrast and extract more detail. And then I'll just reduce the influence, the factor right here, and see what that looks like. Yeah, and I think that just gives it just a lot more interesting look. That looks really, really cool. Oh, yes. Maybe I'll reduce the opacity, the factor a bit more, just like that. So if I were rendering this in cycles, I wouldn't use the vertex color method, because if you made any edits to the mesh, you'd have to go back and again extract that map again so that you can capture the new detail that you created. But if you use the pointiness attribute in the geometry node, which only works in cycles, it gathers this data dynamically. So the mask you're using will be changing as these blobs inflate and become smaller. And that has this really cool side effect if you look at this animation in the intro, where as the blobs become bigger, they sort of look more fresh and ready to pop. And as they become smaller, they sort of like dry up and change in color, which I think was a really cool side effect. Yeah, so that's it for this video. I hope you learned something from this one. Oh yeah, and by the way, I've just dropped a fresh new tribal skull pack. It's a collection of different types of skulls with these sorts of engraved designs that I like to use on my designs. So you can grab that over at Gumroad. You can also get a free demo file for this effect, so you can dig into it and dissect it and add into it and just do with it whatever you like. So yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you very soon in the next one.